Alright, since this is the first swing analysis to be featured on the channel, I would like to make a few things clear before we begin. First and foremost, this is not in any way an authoritative analysis in which I am commenting on what is good, bad, and how things should be done in the golf swing. The truth is that an authoritative swing analysis is virtually non-existent. There is no finite set of standards that makes a golf swing good or bad. That is not to say that some swings are not better than others, but the perfect swing for one person might look entirely different than the perfect swing for another person. I think this is one of the pitfalls of the type of swing analysis that is far too prevalent on YouTube and in general. Too many instructors analyze swings but fail to mention that what might work for Rory or Scotty or Tiger Woods might not be the best thing for everyone else. Golf instruction tends to break down when applied in such general terms. The following analysis and all other swing analysis in the From the Files series, unless otherwise mentioned, will contain my own opinions about the swing, including what the golfer does well, what makes his swing unique, and other details. To this end, this section will be more of an overview focusing on the highlights. If we were to do a full, in-depth analysis, it would require not only a lot more research, but is also, as far as I'm concerned, practically impossible without consulting Rasmus himself and making note of his own views, beliefs, and historic tendencies with his own golf swing. The goal is not to be critical in the swing analysis sections. Rather, the goal is to learn more about the featured golfer's game so that we might be able to understand what makes the golfer, in this case Rasmus, such a good player. Hopefully the knowledge gained in this section will help you improve, whether that involves imitation or using some elements of Rasmus's game as a form of inspiration for your own. This might be one of the most overlooked parts when analyzing a player, but studying the history of one's golf swing is immensely important. The evolution of a player's swing can reveal tendencies and flaws that would otherwise have been very difficult to point out. In the way that studying history helps you not only better understand the present times, but gives you the ability to anticipate future events as they unfold, the same principles apply to the study of the golf swing. Alright, so here are a few videos of Rasmus from 2016. Thankfully, Rasmus has a lot of swing videos online, so it wasn't too hard to find the earlier ones. First thing I want to point out is just how similar his outfit is to Adam Scott. But anyway, his swing is also very similar to Adam Scott, his setup especially. So I'm not sure if Adam Scott played an influence in Rasmus's development of his golf swing, but there are definitely some similarities, especially in the setup. The other thing I want to make note of, especially in these earlier swings, is just the right foot and how he transfers his weight. This is pretty unique. I think this makes Rasmus's swing unique in just the way that his right foot doesn't release as much as other players. Now, whether that's an indication of a lack of weight transfer or something else going on, not too sure. But it would be wrong not to point it out because it is a unique thing about Rasmus's swing. It's something that's changed over the years, but you can still see a bit of the patterns that were there early in his golf career. So that's one thing I want to point out. Also, another thing is the takeaway. And Rasmus has an interesting takeaway. The takeaway of Rasmus's golf swing is maybe what makes it unique, one of the defining elements. And I think it's related to one of the best parts of Rasmus's golf swing, which we'll get to later on. But the takeaway, especially in the early years, seems to have a more open club face. And an open club face, I don't like to use those terms because open and close is usually, those are relative terms. So, but just pay attention to how the club face is orientated in the takeaway and how this changes throughout the years. And we'll skip ahead a few videos and you'll be able to see how this changes. But right here, the club about halfway back is pointing pretty straight up in the air. And I think this is something that's changed. I'm not sure whether Rasmus worked on this or it happened naturally, but it does look like it's something that changed. And I think his swing right now is the best that it's ever been as I'm making this video. But anyway, so as we skip ahead, we go to 2017. Really not much changes from 2017 to 2016. But if we go ahead 1 year to 2018, we can really start to see a difference. This looks like maybe it's the range at OSU. Rasmus would be a freshman here. You can start to see the changes. Not only is the swing starting to look more refined than it was in 2016, 2017, but it's really starting to change in terms of the takeaway. And I think this is closely tied to one of the best elements of Rasmus's swing, as I mentioned earlier, which we'll get to later on. But just pay attention to how the club face is more pointed towards the ground. In 2016, 2017, it was pointed pretty straight up in the air. More of what you would call a neutral club face. Now it's definitely in a stronger position, and that's something that changes throughout the years. Now, skipping ahead to 2025, yeah, this swing is unbelievable. One of the reasons why I chose to feature Rasmus Neergaard-Petersen first on this series is just because of how much I like his golf swing. I think his setup is probably, if not the best setup in the game, one of the best. I don't like to give rules as far as setup goes. I think it's really important to develop an eye for a good setup. And you can just see, if you know what a good setup looks like, how balanced, how poised his posture is, the way the arms are hanging. There looks like there's no tension in the setup. And once you get a good setup, it's not very hard or difficult to make a good swing after that. It's really difficult to make a good swing from a bad setup. If you're going to only copy one thing from Rasmus's golf swing, it might be the setup, because it is very, very good. But pay attention to the club face here. Now, this is similar to 2018, where it's a little bit stronger, and we haven't yet gone into the full analysis of his swing yet. But this is one point I want to highlight. It's just how strong the club face is in the takeaway. This is something that's a little bit different from his earlier years, in that the club face was a lot more neutral. But relative to a lot of other players, this is a fairly strong club face. So just pay attention to that. We'll talk more about it later on. But I just want to highlight it, and yeah. All right, so now we are getting into the full analysis, and what better place to start than with the setup? I think the setup is arguably one of the most important parts of the golf swing. If you don't have a good setup, the rest of the swing is a lot more difficult. The setup is essentially the foundation of your swing upon which everything else is built. If you don't have a solid foundation, it's very difficult to make a good golf swing. Two things I think are important with setup are consistency and being neutral, especially if you're developing as a golfer. So being consistent means making sure that your setup doesn't drift, because the setup does tend to drift a lot. It's one of those things that's always changing. So it's important to have video, or if not video, somebody else watching it, so that you can make sure you're staying on top of things with as far as the setup is concerned. The other thing is being neutral, because the setup can dictate a lot of the rest of the golf swing. If you have a grip that's unique, or either very strong or very weak, that can influence the way your golf swing develops. So those two things I think are important. If you've been playing golf for a while, just try to keep it consistent. Maybe make incremental changes over time. If you're developing, try to keep it neutral, because if you can learn from a neutral setup position, you are going to be much better off in the long run. It's just going to be a lot easier. So Rasmus's setup is very neutral, and it's obvious that he pays a lot of attention to it, because it is essentially perfect. It's balanced. You can see that it just has a professional look to it. I don't really know how else to describe it, because if you see enough golf swings, you know what a good setup looks like. But Rasmus's setup, it has that professional finish to it. So his grip is pretty neutral, maybe slightly strong. I think if you're going to be either strong or weak, I think strong is preferred. His stance is pretty standard, not too wide, not too narrow. And his feet are flared out maybe slightly more than a lot of other people, or at least the way that people are taught, because people are taught these days to turn your right foot, or the rear foot, the foot that's further away from the target, in towards the golf ball. And this helps with the hip turn. They say that you can restrict your hip turn, and it gives you more resistance in the backswing. Rasmus doesn't do that. His feet are flared, which is common in the left foot for a right-handed golfer, or the lead foot. But Rasmus, both of his feet are flared. This makes sense. and it makes sense with the rest of his golf swing because he does have a pretty substantial rotation in his golf swing. He uses his hips and shoulders a lot. I think this is a good thing. I think this is something that's not looked at enough. I think it's not taught enough. But flaring your feet and having which allows big hip turn and rotation of the torso is something that's overlooked. And for the longest time, people said restrict the hip turn, and that's how you play golf. You have to restrict your hip turn. I think now people are starting to realize that that was never a good idea. So if you want to experiment with flaring the feet out, changing the setup a little bit, go ahead, feel free. I think Rasmus is an excellent golfer to copy in terms of the setup. Rasmus has a good setup. He's standing on business.
You're not getting it. It's not clocking to you. It's not clocking to you that I'm standing on business, is it?
And because of this, the rest of the swing starts to fall into place. So I mentioned earlier that Rasmus's takeaway is closely tied to one of the best elements of his golf swing. Here's what I mean by that. So Rasmus has all the markings of a modern golfer. By all accounts, he would have what people would say a textbook golf swing. Very balanced, neutral address position, powerful move. But here's what makes it interesting. Rasmus takes the club back in a way that's fairly traditional. And by traditional, I don't mean old school or outdated or no longer the correct way of doing things. By traditional, I mean that it was far more common in the days of Jack Nicklaus, Lee Trevino, Gary Player, going back to Ben Hogan, Sam Snead, Bobby Jones, as far back as you want to go. So pay attention to how quiet the right arm is in the first part of the golf swing. It doesn't fold, it doesn't hinge, it really doesn't do anything at all. This is what's called a passive right arm. This is an indication that Rasmus is not moving the club with his arms and hands. Rather, he's moving it with his torso, his chest, his shoulders, his bigger muscles. What this allows him to do is create a full turn and use the momentum of the club head to propel himself into a good position at the top. Now, a lot of modern players have wide takeaways in which the arms and wrists are very passive. But what makes Rasmus's swing unique and fairly traditional is that in not using much wrist hinge or arm hinge in the backswing, the set of the club is done mostly with the momentum and weight of the club head itself. This is very traditional and something that you saw a lot more in the early days of golf, and arguably more natural way to take the club back. Here's an old swing video of Harry Vardon from 1923, which is an exaggerated example of what I'm talking about, but also Sam Snead and even Jack Nicklaus were pretty famous for taking the club back in this way, along with many other golfers.